Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and today we will be reviewing the Ryzen 5 5600X, which is AMD's brand new 6-core 12-thread CPU, which is the replacement for the Ryzen 5 3600X and 3600XT. Both of those CPUs, some of my favourites among AMD's offerings. The 3600, of course, one of the best-selling processors of all time, like its predecessor as well, the 2600. So AMD's 6 cores then, very, very popular among enthusiasts, and what we're hoping to see today is not just great multi-threaded performance, which we've always seen from AMD's 6-core CPUs for the money, but awesome gaming performance as well, because the Ryzen 7 5800X and Ryzen 9 5900X have pretty much taken the CPU world by storm and offer the same or better performance than Intel in games, which is what everybody's been talking about for the last week or two. So it's great to see AMD really hammering home its competition here, and what I'm hoping to see today is basically the perfect all-round CPU. We'll have to wait and see in the benchmarks. So to start with then, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I've got loads more content coming up with features, mini ITX, build guides, and of course more CPU and graphics card reviews. We've got AMD's graphics cards coming up soon. And just a word on my testing. I use basically Wonder and Cosmo are my two test benches. I've got Wonder here, who has been dealing with the AMD CPU testing, along with an RTX 3080 there. So basically, if there's any kind of CPU throttling or anything like that, the RTX 3080 is a great card to show that in games. And you can see all the test settings in the actual graphs that I'll be talking about as well. Whole bunch of other hardware here. So the system is obviously water cooled. I've got two 240mm radiators around the back here. So whether I'm water cooling a Ryzen 5 5600X or a 64-core Threadripper, this system should be able to handle it and give consistent results. And Corsair Hydro X, water cooling hardware, including the CPU water block and the pump around here, as well as fans too. And the actual test bench I'm using is the Barrow Ropalema test bench, which is basically like one giant distribution plate here, which just looks really, really cool and makes it easier for me to test stuff, because I can get at stuff from the top and quickly swap things out and that kind of thing. So absolutely loving my new test benches. So don't forget to subscribe to my channel. As I say, it means a lot to have your support, and turn those notifications on as well. And I'll be back with loads more content too. So without further ado, let's talk about the specifications of the Ryzen 5 5600X. So what we're looking at here then is a peak boost speed of 4.6 gigahertz. You won't see that across all cores though. I found that something in the region of 4.3, 4.4 gigahertz was usually what you'd see in an all-core boosting situation, such as Cinebench or Prime 95, those kind of things. However, it's a fair bit higher than the base frequency of 3.7 gigahertz. I think that's just a guide. I wouldn't read too much into the base frequencies, because the 5000 series seems to be able to go way higher than those on their all-core boosts. So obviously 6 cores and 12 threads with the Ryzen 5 5600X, and as I previously mentioned, that's equivalent to the Ryzen 5 3600X. You get 32 megabytes of L3 cache, because we're dealing with a single CCX here, a single 8-core CCX, which basically has 2 cores disabled. So you're still getting the same L3 cache as the 8-core Ryzen 7 5800X, which is great. However, you are 1 megabyte down on the L2 cache, because you're basically the L2 cache is tied to the core count. So you're losing out on 2 cores worth of L2 cache, so you're only getting 3 megabytes versus 4 megabytes for the Ryzen 7 5800X. So the 5800X does have a little bit of an advantage there. So TDP of just 65 watts though on this part, which is very, very tameable as far as cooling goes. In the box, I will get it out now, you do actually get a Wraith CPU cooler. So unlike the other CPUs in the Ryzen 5000 range, this is the only one so far to actually include a processor cooler. So it's fairly dinky. You're only dealing with a 65 watt CPU, as I mentioned. So, but you do get a cooler in the box, which is enough to handle it. Maybe not enough to handle an overclock without it screaming, but it's certainly enough to run it at stock speed. So if you're really looking to to cut those thermals and to not cut those thermals, but to actually cut your price even. Not cut your thermals, you'll need a better cooler if you want to cut your thermals. If you want to really rein in the price, then you can potentially consider using it. It is only a 65 watt CPU, so that cooler is more than enough to handle it. However, I would recommend going for at least something like the Arctic Freezer 7X, which I've got up here actually. So Freezer 7X, absolutely great CPU for the money, and I would recommend picking this one up and using that with this CPU, because this is enough to overclock it. It's enough to greatly reduce those noise levels compared to the stock cooler, and you can see a link to this fantastic CPU cooler. It's really cheap as well. You can see a link to this cooler in the description below. So without further ado then, let's take a look at the performance numbers. Okay, starting off with overclocking then, and the Ryzen 5 5600X managed 4.7 gigahertz with, that's an all-core overclock with a voltage of 1.25 volts, which is fairly reasonable. I wouldn't want to go any higher than that. This is kind of pushing things as high as I would want to go, maybe for my own personal 24/7 overclock with this CPU. Other people have got higher with higher voltages, but generally you shouldn't really go much above 1.2, 1.25. But anyway, 4.7 gigahertz all-core is amazing, and that actually matches the all-core stock speed boost as well, which is great, so you're not losing any boosting frequency. And moving on to Far Cry New Dawn then, at stock speed, the 5600X was faster than the Core i5 10600K on the average frame rate, but managed an identical minimum frame rate. So the average 99th percentile went up from 142 to 155, so a clear win there for AMD. Versus the Ryzen 5 3600X, well, a minimum 99th percentile of 86 frames per second versus 101. That's a huge step up. In fact, I'd say that's probably worth an upgrade right there. And you're getting an extra more than 30 frames per second on the average frame rate as well, so 121 frames per second versus 155. So great result there for AMD. The Ryzen 7 5800X, not really offering that much more performance, another 5 frames per second on the minimum 99th percentile, and about another 7 frames per second on the average frame rate. So maybe potentially worth it if you're looking for absolutely maximum performance, but in general the Ryzen 5 5600X does exactly what you need it to, and once overclocked you're getting an identical minimum 99th percentile to the Ryzen 7 5800X as well, with the minimum 99th percentile rising to 106 frames per second, but just gaining 1 frames per second on the average frame rate. Okay, next up is Metro Exodus, and again at 1080p with RTX features turned on. The Ryzen 5 5600X performed pretty well with a minimum 99th percentile of 56 frames per second. That's not that much faster than the Ryzen 5 3600X, but it did have a much higher average frame rate. So that's looking at, where are we in the graph? So we're looking at 93 frames per second versus 107 frames per second. So probably not worth upgrading just for that, but still a significant uptick. And the Core i5 10600K is a reasonably quick processor in this game. So we're looking at a minimum of 59 frames per second versus 56. But once again, the AMD CPU managed a much higher average frame rate at 107 frames per second versus 98. So overall, I would probably go with the AMD CPU again here, and you're not really losing out that much more performance compared to the other Ryzen 5000 series CPUs either. The great thing about the Ryzen 5 5600X though is that it's a great overclocker, and once overclocked to 4.7 gigahertz, it was the fastest performing AMD CPU out there. It had a minimum 99th percentile of 59 frames per second and average of 111. So actually the fastest gaming AMD CPU in the Ryzen 5000 series, and actually overall as well. And the last game test then is Wolfenstein Youngblood, and at 1080p with the RTX 3080 at the helm with RTX and DLSS turned on. We've got absolutely stonking performance from the Ryzen 5 5600X here. Virtually nothing lost compared to the more expensive Ryzen 5000 series CPUs either. And not much performance gained from overclocking though, just a couple of frames on the average frame rate, so not really worth overclocking the CPU in this game. However, it's miles faster than both the stock speed and overclocked Core i5-10600K. The most that managed when overclocked was 185 on the minimum 99 percentile versus 200 with the Ryzen 5. And at stock speed, the AMD CPU was clearly a heck of a lot faster. Also much faster than the Core i9-9900K. Even when overclocked, that could only manage a minimum of 185 frames per second. And also a big win here for AMD, the Core i9-10900K was actually slower than the Ryzen 5 5600X at stock speed. Only when overclocked did the 10900K beat it, but only then on the minimum 99 percentile, the AMD CPU was still faster on that average frame rate. So compared to the Ryzen 5 3600X, way down the graph, a minimum of 156 frames per second. So that's a massive increase here. If you do play this game a lot, the new AMD CPU, the Ryzen 5 5600X, is absolutely worth upgrading. Even though it's just a single generation, the performance improvement is huge. And running into content creation now, and we've got Handbrake and the Ryzen 5 3600X knocking a huge amount off the Ryzen 5 3600X time in this 4K video encode, and is also significantly faster than the Core i5-10600K. Massive difference there, so 40 seconds faster in a benchmark that just takes 140 seconds to run on the Ryzen 5 5600X, so way faster here. And really the only competition that the Ryzen 5 5600X has is from the 8-core CPUs in the test. So starting with the Core i9-9900K was a little bit faster, but once overclocked, the Ryzen 5 5600X actually beat its stock score. It's the 9900K's stock speed score, and came within 1 second of matching it once it was overclocked, which is a huge result for AMD there. Also, not that much slower than the Ryzen 7 3800X as well, which just goes to show the difference between the Zen 2 and Zen 3, the extra performance you get. The only way to get significantly more grunt though is to go for the Ryzen 7 5800X, which was significantly quicker. So if you are going to be doing a lot of video encoding, then you might want to step up to the 8-core CPU, but otherwise the Ryzen 5 5600X, great multi-threaded performance for the cache. And as we've seen with the other Ryzen 5000 series CPUs, the Ryzen 5 5600X offered a massive single-threaded score of just 600. 600 points is obviously a fair bit lower than the Ryzen 7 and the Ryzen 9 of the 5000 series, which managed at 627 and 641, but still 600 points is an absolutely massive score. It's 60 points at least clear of the next CPU, which is a huge result in this single-threaded test. You never usually see that much difference from a single generation. And compared to the Core i5-10600K, then it's miles ahead, more than 100 points, which is a huge amount in this test. As I say, significantly quicker than the Core i9-10900K as well. That managed just 520 points. And even significantly faster than the Ryzen 9 3950X, which was AMD's previous best performing CPU in this test. So excellent single-threaded performance from the Ryzen 5 5600X. Okay, next up then is the multi-threaded test in Cinebench, and once again the Ryzen 5 5600X providing significant uplift from the Ryzen 5 3600X, a 600 point advantage at stock speed, and even a bigger difference compared to the Core i5 10600K, which was well down with 3500 points versus 4300 for the Ryzen 5 5600X. So by far and away the fastest 6-core CPU out there right now. And as I mentioned, you need to step up to an 8-core CPU to get significantly more performance here. That said, the Core i9-9900K didn't offer that much more performance, especially once the two CPUs were overclocked. The Ryzen 5 5600X, once overclocked, coming within about 200-300 points of the 9900K, which is usually significantly more expensive. The 10700K, which is basically the same, is at least sort of $70 or $80 more expensive, and you're not getting that much grunt here, extra grunt here. So the Ryzen 7 3800X does still provide significantly more performance than the Ryzen 5 5600X. So if you've got one of those, then you'll need to step up to a much more powerful processor than the Ryzen 5 5600X to get more performance. But if you do a lot of video encoding and you've got an older 6-core CPU, then you could consider an upgrade. But the Ryzen 5 5600X kind of on its own there in the middle, just thanks to that great uplift, thanks to the Zen 3 architecture providing significantly more performance and allowing it to snap at the heels of the 8-core CPUs in the test. So next is Adobe Premiere Pro, and in this test I'm using GPU acceleration for the export of the 4K video project, and that really does limit the amount that the CPU is used, so there's not that much difference between all of the CPUs on test. However, the Ryzen 5 5600X did manage the fastest stock speed and overclock scores of any Ryzen 5000 series CPU, largely thanks to its high all-core boosting frequency, and once overclocked, obviously it's faster than all the other CPUs as well, managing an all-core overclock of 4.7 gigahertz. So overall, these results are kind of within the margin of error that I would expect for this test. The Core i5 10600K, not that much slower. Again, there's a lot of load on the GPU here rather than the CPU. And but if you're looking back at older CPUs, then you can expect a modest uplift at best if you're using the GPU acceleration. Okay, it's our final performance test then, and it's the PCMark 10 image editing test. And what we're looking at here is a GIMP image editing tool based benchmark, and the Ryzen 5 5600X, a stock speed score of 18,000 or thereabouts, and that contrasts to 15,000 for the Core i5 10600K, so a reasonable uplift there. However, the Ryzen 5 3600X managed a similar score at stock speed, but once overclocked, the Ryzen 5 5600X stretched its legs and managed a respectable score of 20,221, which is significantly quicker than a lot of other CPUs. Namely the Ryzen 7 3800X, but you need to step up to the likes of the Ryzen 9 3900X, Ryzen 7 5800X to get a similar performance output, and the Ryzen 5 5600X also faster in this test than the Core i9 10900K, and only when overclocked could the Intel CPU match the stock speed score, but the AMD CPU was much quicker once overclocked. So the final test then is the power consumption, and unsurprisingly the Ryzen 5 5600X had the lowest power draw on test, actually slightly lower than the Ryzen 5 3600X, but that could just be down to different BIOS versions and different motherboards and that kind of thing. So, but even so, a very, very low power draw. You're not really looking at having to get a significantly powerful cooler here. As I mentioned earlier, the Wraith cooler in the box will be more than capable of handling this CPU. But if you want to get obviously more better thermal performance and lower noise levels, then do consider going for the Arctic Freezer 7X, which I mentioned in the description. But really, it's a very, very easy CPU to deal with in terms of power supplies. I mean, this is the system draw, so it's not just the processor power draw, it's actually the system as a whole under load. And even that massive overclock only saw the power consumption rise to 262 watts for the system as a whole. So chuck in a powerful graphics card and you won't really be needing a power supply much more than 500 watts at most to deal with the system under load. So what do we make of the Ryzen 5 5600X then? Well, it's kind of everything I hoped it would be, and as I've already said, I do have a bit of a sweet spot for AMD 6-core CPUs because they just offered so much more multi-threaded performance and all-round performance than their Intel equivalents, especially back when Intel's Core i5s were mainly 4-core CPUs. So what we're looking at then is a CPU with monstrous multi-threaded performance that outstrips Intel by huge margins, but the benefit with the Ryzen 5 5600X and the Zen 3 architecture is that you also match or better Intel in games. So what we're looking at here is pretty much the perfect all-round processor. It's great at everything. You get way more multi-threaded and content creation performance than its competitors. It's much faster than its predecessor, and you get great gaming performance. So I absolutely have no hesitation recommending the Ryzen 5 5600X. And even if you're looking for something in the sort of $200 to $250 mark, you should absolutely consider spending the extra $50 and getting this CPU. So well done, AMD, and thanks for watching my video, and don't forget to subscribe.